wedges snap loose and are wrenched off in turn. Lamps and knobs are beaten, tagged and twisted. More children emerge from other filthy doorways, ready for their share. Those with sleeves roll them up, those without fall to work without delay. Despite their strong hands and wrinkled beetle brows, none of them is older than 8 or 9, for although every able-bodied inhabitant of Church Lane is wide awake now, it's only these younger children who can be spared to strip the cab. Everyone else is either drunk or busy preparing for a long day's work and the long walk to where it may be had. Soon the cab is as warm with undeserving poor, all laboring to remove something of value. Practically everything is of value, the cab being an object designed for a caste many grades above theirs. Its body is made of such rare materials as iron, brass, good dry wood, leather, glass, felt, wire, and rope. Even the stuffing in the seats can be sewn into a pillow much superior to a rolled-up potato sack, without speaking, and each according to what he has in the way of tools and footwear. The children hammer and gouge, yank and kick as the sound echoes dryly in the harsh air and the framework of the handsome shutters on the cobblestones. They know their time is likely to be short, but it proves to be even shorter than expected. Scarcely more than 15 minutes after the first urchin's assault on the wreck, a massive 2-horse brewer's dray turns the corner and rumbles up the lane. It carries nothing except the cabman and Freewell Mason's companions. Most of the children immediately run home with their splintery armfuls. The most brazen persists for another couple of seconds, until angry shouts of "clear off" and "thief" sound them scaring. By the time the dray draws up to the wreck, Church Lane is empty again, its house fronts innocent and shadowy, its windows full of faces. The foreman alight and walk slowly around the cab, clockwise and counterclockwise, flexing their massive hands, squaring their meaty shoulders. Then at the cabman's signal, they lay hands on the four corners of the wreck, and with one groaning heave, load it onto the dray. It settles more or less upright, 2 of its wheels having been plundered. No time is wasted. Scooping up the smaller fragments, the horse snorts jets of steam as it's whipped into motion, and the 3 helpers jump on, steadying themselves against the mangled cab. The cabman pauses only to shake his fist at the scavengers behind the windows and yell, "This here was my life," and then he too is carted away. His melodramatic gesture impresses nobody. To the people of Church Lane, he is a lucky man, a survivor who ought to be grateful. For as the dray rattles off, it exposes a pattern of dark blood nestled between the cobbles like a winding crimson weed. From where you stand, you can actually see the shiver of distaste traveling down between Caroline's shoulder blades. She's not brave about blood, never has been. For a moment it seems likely she'll turn away from the window, but then she shudders exaggeratedly to shake off the goose flesh and leans forward again. The tray has gone, and here and there along the house front's doors are swinging open and figures are emerging. This time it's not children but adults, that is, those hardened souls who've passed the age of 10. The ones who have a moment to spare, the bill poster, the scrubber, and the fellow who sells paper windmills, total to examine the blood spill. The others hurry past, wrapping shawls or scarves around their scrawny necks, swallowing hard on the last crust of breakfast. For those who work in the factories and slop shops, jobs, lateness means instant dismissal, and for those who seek a day's casual laboring, there's nothing casual about the prospect of 50 men getting turned away when the fittest has been chosen. Caroline shudders again, this time from the chill of a distant memory, for she was one of these slaves herself once, hurrying into the grey dawn. Every morning, weeping with exhaustion every night, even nowadays every so often, when she has drunk too much and sleeps too deeply, a brood vestige of habit wakes her up in time to go to the factory. Anxious, barely conscious, she'll shove her body out of bed onto the bare floor, just the way she used to, not until she has crawled to the chair where her cotton smoke ought to be hanging ready, and finds no smoke there, does she remember who and what she's become, and crawl back into her warm bed. Today, however, the accident has shocked her so wide awake that there's no point trying to get more sleep just yet. She can try again in the afternoon. Indeed, she'd better try again then, to reduce the risk of falling asleep next to some snoring idiot tonight. A simple fuck is one thing, but let a man sleep with you just once, and he thinks he can bring his dog and his pigeons. Responsibilities, responsibilities, to get enough sleep, to remember to comb her hair, to wash after every man. These are the sorts of things she must make sure she doesn't neglect these days. Compared to the burdens she once shared with her fellow factory slaves, they aren't too bad. As for the work, well, it's not as dirty as the factory, nor as dangerous, nor as dull. At the cost of her immortal soul, she has earned the right to lie in on a weekday morning and get up when she damn well chooses. Caroline stands at the window, watching Nellie Griffiths and old Mrs. Mulvaney trot down the street on their way to the jam factory. Poor ugly biddies, herself a citizen of that same world her employer was trying to keep safe. So she handed him the £5 and began her career as a manufacturess of waistcoats and trousers. The work proved to be tolerably easy, and it seemed to her well paid. In some weeks she earned 6 shillings or more, although from this must be deducted the cost of cotton, coals for pressing, and candles. She never skimmed on candles, determined not to become one of those half-blind seamstresses squinting over their work by window at dusk. She pitied the shirt makers, eulogized in The Song of the Shirt, in the same way that a respectable shopkeeper might pity a ragged costermonger. Though keenly aware of how much she'd come down in the world, she was not dissatisfied. There was enough to eat for her and her boy. Their lodgings in shitty streets were clean and neat, and Caroline, being husbandless, was free to spend her money wisely. Then winter came, and of course the child fell ill. Nursing him lost Caroline valuable time, particularly in the daylight hours, and when at last he rallied, she had no choice but to engage his help. "You must be my big, brave man," she told him, her face burning, her eyes averted towards the single candle lighting their shadowy labors. No proposal she would ever make in later years could be more shameful than this one. And so mother and son became workmates, propped up against Caroline's legs. The child folded and pressed the garments she had sewn. She tried to make a game of it, urging him to imagine a long line of naked, shivering gentlemen waiting for their trousers. But the work fell further and further behind, and her drowsy boy fell forwards more and more often, so that in order to prevent him burning himself or the material with the pressing iron, she had to pin the back of his shirt to her dress. This dismal partnership didn't last very long. With dozens of waistcoats still waiting, the tags at her skirts became so frequent it was obvious the boy was more than merely tired. He was dying. And so Caroline went to retrieve her bond from her employer. She came away with £2 and 3 shillings and a sick, impotent fury that lasted for a month. The money lasted slightly longer than that, and with her child in marginally better health due to medical attention, Caroline found work in a sweater stand making hats, jamming squares of cloth onto steaming iron heads. All day she was handing dark, shiny, scalding hats farther along a line of women, as if passing on plates of food in an absurdly steamy kitchen. Her child, forgive this impersonality, Caroline never speaks his name anymore, spent his days locked in their squalid new lodgings with his painted bull and his Bristol toys, stowing in his sickliness and fatherless misery. He was always fractious, whimpering over small things, as if daring her to lose patience. Then one night at the end of winter, he began coughing and wheezing like a demented terrier pup. It was a night very like the one we are in now, bitter and muggy, worried that no doctor would agree at such an hour, and in such weather, to accompany her unpaid to where she lived. Caroline conceived a plan. Oh, she'd heard of doctors who were kind and devoted to their calling, and who would march into the slums to combat their ancient foe disease, but in all her time in London, Caroline had not met any such doctor, so she thought she'd better try deception first. She dressed in her best clothes, the bodice was made of felt stolen from the factory, and dragged her boy out into the street with her. The plan, such as it was to deceive the nearest physician into believing she was new to London and hadn't family doctor yet, and had been all evening at the theatre, and only realized her son was ill when spiteful gossips, the lot of them, and Caroline doesn't want them accusing her of soliciting cholera on top of everything else. So she tips the chamber pot slowly forwards and lets the mixture trickle discreetly down the brickwork. For a while the building will look as though God relieved himself against it, but then the problem will get solved one way or another before the neighbors wake up. Either the sun will dry it or fresh snow will rinse it. Caroline is hungry now, a sharp belly hunger, despite the fact that she doesn't normally wake until much, much later. She's noticed that before. If you wake up too early, you're famished, but if you wake later, you're all right again, and then later still you're famished again. Needs and desires must rise and fall during sleep, clamoring for satisfaction at the door of consciousness, then slinking away for a while. A deep thinker, that's what her husband used to call her. Too much education might have done her more harm than good. Caroline's guts make a noise like a piglet. She laughs and decides to give Abby a surprise by paying an early morning visit to the mother's finest. Put a smile in his ugly face and a pie in her belly. In the cold light of day, the clothes she hastily threw on in order to see the ragged cap don't pass muster. Rough hands have wrinkled the fabric, dirty shoes have stepped on the hems, there are even speckles of blood from the scabbageons of old Leah the dyer. Caroline strips off and starts afresh with a voluminous blue and grey strip dress and tight black bodice straight out of her wardrobe. Getting dressed is much easier for Caroline than it is for most of the women you will meet later in this story. She has made small cunning alterations to all her clothing. Fastenings have been shifted in defiance of fashion to where her hands can reach them, and each layer hides shortcuts in the layer beneath. See, her seamstressing skills did come in useful in the end. To her face and hair, Caroline affords a little more attention, scrutinizing the particulars in a small hand mirror tacked upside down to the wall. She's in fair repair for 29, a few pale scars on her forehead and chin, one black tooth that doesn't hurt a bit and is best left alone. Eyes a little bloodshot, but big and sympathetic, like those of a dog that's had a good master. Decent lips, eyebrows as good as anyone's, and of course her splendid nest of hair. With a wire brush she untangles the fringe and flaps it out over her forehead, squaring it just above the eyes with the back of her hand. Too impatient and hungry to comb the rest, she binds it up into a pile on top of her head and pins it fast, then covers it up with an indigo hat. Her face she powders and pinks, not to conceal that she's old, ugly, or corrupt in flesh, for she isn't any of these yet, but rather to brighten the pallor of her sunless existence, this for her own sake rather than for her customers. Arranging her shawl now, smoothing down the front of her dress, she resembles a respectably well-to-do woman in a way she never could have managed when she slaved in the steam of the hat factory, suffering for her virtue. Not that an authentic lady could so much as fasten a garter in less than 5 minutes, let alone dress completely without a maid's assistance. Caroline knows very well she's a cheap imitation, but fancies herself a cheekily good one, especially considering how little effort she puts into it. She slips out of her room like a pretty moth emerging from a husk of dried slime. Follow discreetly after her. But you are not going anywhere very exciting yet. Be patient a while longer. On the landing and the stairs, all of last night's candles have burned out. No new ones will be lit until the girls start bringing the men home in the afternoon, so there's not much light to see Caroline downstairs. The landing hall is Colonel Leek, seated in his wheelchair. Though he is buried very near the foot of the stairs, he faces the front door, his back to Caroline, and she hopes that this morning he might for once be asleep. "Think I'm asleep, don't you, girlie?" he promptly sneers. "No, never," she laughs, though it's far too early in the day for her to be a convincing liar. She squeezes past the colonel and lets him examine her for a moment so as not to be rude, for he never forgets an insult. Colonel Leek is the landlady's uncle, a pot-bellied stove of a man, keeping the warmth in with overcoats, scarves and blankets, stoking up on gossip and puffing out smoke through a stunted pipe. Concealed under all the layers, Colonel Leek still wears his military uniform, complete with medals, though these have a handkerchief sewn over them to prevent them catching. In the last war he went to, the colonel accepted a bullet in the spine in exchange for a chance to take pot shots at mutineering Indians, and his niece has cared for him ever since, installing him as her toll collector when she opened the empty rooms of her house to prostitutes. Colonel Leek performs his job with grim efficiency, but his true passion remains war and other outbursts of violence and disaster. When he reads his daily newspaper, happy events and proud achievements fail to capture his interest, but as soon as he comes across a calamity, he cannot contain himself. It often happens that Caroline, hard at work in her room, must suddenly croon more loudly in a customer's ear to cover the noise of a hoarsely shouted recitation from downstairs, such as 6,000 Tartars have invaded the Amur province, wrested 15 years ago from China. through Church Lane, as she notes where the tongue is most densely congregated. Then watch your step.